Hey everyone, before we dive into today's topic, I just want to take a quick moment to talk about subscribing to the channel. If you're enjoying this content and want to see more in-depth historical deep dives like this one, please hit that subscribe button. It really helps the channel grow and lets me know that you want more of this kind of detailed, comprehensive content. And if you hit the notification bell, you'll be the first to know when I upload new videos. Alright, with that out of the way, let's get into one of the most catastrophic natural disasters in American history. Hurricane Katrina, the storm that changed America. In late August 2005, Hurricane Katrina made landfall on the Gulf Coast of the United States, unleashing a catastrophe of unprecedented proportions that would fundamentally alter the landscape of American disaster response, urban planning, and national consciousness. This wasn't just a hurricane. It was a perfect storm of natural fury, governmental failure, systemic inequality, and human resilience that exposed deep fractures in American society, while simultaneously demonstrating the extraordinary capacity of communities to endure and rebuild. The formation and approach. Hurricane Katrina began as Tropical Depression 12 over the southeastern Bahamas on August 23, 2005. Meteorologists at the National Hurricane Center tracked the system as it strengthened, gaining organization and intensity over the warm waters of the Atlantic. Within hours, the depression upgraded to Tropical Storm Katrina, and forecasters began issuing warnings to Florida's southeastern coast. The storm made its first landfall on August 25 as a Category 1 hurricane near the Miami-Dade and Broward County line in Florida. While this initial landfall caused significant damage, flooding, and 11 deaths in South Florida, it was merely a preview of the devastation to come. The storm's interaction with land weakened it temporarily, but as Katrina emerged over the warm waters of the Gulf of Mexico, conditions became ideal for rapid intensification. The Gulf of Mexico in late August 2005 was exceptionally warm, with sea surface temperatures reaching into the upper 80s Fahrenheit, well above the threshold needed for hurricane intensification. The atmospheric conditions were equally favorable, with low wind shear and high moisture content. These factors created a near-perfect environment for Katrina to explode in intensity. Over the next 2 days, meteorologists watched in growing alarm as Katrina underwent rapid intensification, a phenomenon where a hurricane's maximum sustained winds increase by at least 35 miles per hour within a 24-hour period. By August 27th, Katrina had reached Category 3 status, and by the morning of August 28th, it had become a catastrophic Category 5 hurricane with maximum sustained winds of 175 miles per hour and a central pressure of 902 millibars, one of the lowest pressures ever recorded in the Gulf of Mexico. The National Hurricane Center began issuing increasingly urgent warnings to the central Gulf Coast, particularly Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama. The storm's projected path placed New Orleans directly in harm's way, and forecasters warned of potentially catastrophic storm surge that could overtop the levee system protecting the below-sea-level city. New Orleans, a city built on precarious ground. To understand the magnitude of what was about to unfold, it's essential to understand New Orleans itself, a city with a unique geography, culture, and vulnerability to hurricanes that had been recognized and debated for decades. New Orleans sits in a bowl-shaped depression between the Mississippi River and Lake Pontchartrain, with approximately 50% of the metropolitan area lying below sea level. The city's founding in 1718 by French colonists was based on its strategic location for controlling trade along the Mississippi River, but this strategic advantage came with significant environmental challenges. Over the centuries, the city expanded beyond its original high ground near the river into lower-lying areas. As development spread, engineers built an extensive system of levees, floodwalls, pumps, and drainage canals to keep water out and allow development in areas that would otherwise be uninhabitable. This system, managed by various local levee boards and the Army Corps of Engineers, was designed to protect against hurricanes and flooding, but its effectiveness was limited and, as would become tragically clear, inadequate. The wetlands that once surrounded New Orleans had historically provided a natural buffer against storm surge, absorbing wave energy and reducing flooding. However, decades of coastal erosion, canal dredging for oil and gas exploration, and subsidence caused by groundwater extraction and the weight of development had destroyed vast swaths of these protective wetlands. Louisiana was losing approximately 25 to 35 square miles of coastal land every year, leaving New Orleans increasingly exposed to the full force of Gulf hurricanes. Scientists, engineers, and emergency management officials had long warned about New Orleans' vulnerability. In 2004, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, had conducted a simulation exercise called Hurricane PAM that modeled a slow-moving Category 3 hurricane striking New Orleans. The exercise predicted catastrophic flooding, tens of thousands of deaths, and the complete breakdown of civil society, a chillingly accurate preview of what would occur just 1 year later. Despite these warnings, comprehensive action to strengthen the city's defenses had been hampered by funding limitations, bureaucratic complexity, and the sheer scale of the work needed. The levee system had been built piecemeal over decades, with different sections constructed to different standards. Some levees were designed to withstand Category 3 hurricanes, but many were not built to even that standard, and virtually none could withstand a Category 4 or 5 storm. The evacuation, a tale of two cities. As Katrina churned across the Gulf of Mexico, authorities in Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama began ordering evacuations. On August 27, Louisiana Governor Kathleen Blanco declared a state of emergency, and on August 28, New Orleans Mayor Ray Nagin issued the first-ever mandatory evacuation order in the city's history. The evacuation revealed and exacerbated deep social and economic divisions within New Orleans. Those with resources, cars, money, family, or friends in other areas began leaving the city on Saturday, August 27, creating massive traffic jams on outbound highways. The contraflow plan, which reversed inbound lanes to create additional outbound capacity, helped move vehicles out of the city, but the exodus was chaotic and terrifying. However, an estimated 100,000 to 150,000 people remained in New Orleans as the storm approached. Many of these individuals lacked the means to evacuate. They had no cars, no money for gas or hotels, no place to go, and no way to get there. New Orleans had one of the highest poverty rates of any major American city, with approximately 28% of residents living below the poverty line. In some neighborhoods, particularly in the lower Ninth Ward and other predominantly African-American areas, car ownership rates were extremely low. The city's evacuation plan had a critical flaw. It assumed that people could evacuate themselves. There was no systematic plan to transport those without vehicles out of harm's way. Hundreds of school buses and city buses sat unused in parking lots, later to be flooded and destroyed, while thousands of people who could have been evacuated remained trapped in the city. As the evacuation deadline passed and the storm approached, those who remained behind sought refuge wherever they could. An estimated 10,000 to 20,000 people went to the Louisiana Superdome, which had been designated as a refuge of last resort. The Superdome was never intended to be a true shelter with adequate supplies, food, water, and medical care. It was meant only to provide protection from the wind and rain for those with absolutely no other option. Others gathered at the Ernest N. Memorial Convention Center, though this facility had not been officially designated as a shelter and lacked even the minimal preparations that had been made at the Superdome. Thousands more stayed in their homes, whether by choice, necessity, or misunderstanding of the danger they faced. Landfall and initial impact. In the early morning hours of August 29, 2005, Hurricane Katrina made its second and most devastating landfall near Burris, Louisiana, as a Category 3 hurricane with sustained winds of 125 miles per hour. The storm size was extraordinary. Hurricane-force winds extended 120 miles from the center, and tropical storm-force winds reached out 230 miles, meaning the storm's effects were felt across an area roughly the size of the United Kingdom. The eye wall of Katrina passed just east of New Orleans, placing the city in the northeastern quadrant of the storm, typically the most dangerous area of a hurricane due to the additive effect of the storm's forward motion and rotational winds. This positioning drove massive storm surge from the Gulf of Mexico through Lake Borgne, the Gulf Intracoastal Waterway, and the Mississippi River Gulf Outlet, a shipping channel known as Mr. Go, directly toward the city's eastern levees. The storm surge was catastrophic. In some areas along the Mississippi coast, the surge reached 27 to 28 feet above normal tide levels, among the highest ever recorded in the United States. The surge completely destroyed coastal communities in Mississippi, reducing entire neighborhoods to concrete slabs and debris fields. Coastal casinos that had been required by law to be built on barges in the water were torn from their moorings and pushed hundreds of yards inland. As Katrina's winds howled through New Orleans, the city's power grid failed, plunging the region into darkness. Trees snapped, roofs peeled away, and windows shattered across the metropolitan area. The rain came in horizontal sheets, driven by winds that made it nearly impossible to stand outside. Those who had sheltered in the Superdome huddled in the darkened stadium as the storm tore away large sections of the roof, allowing rain to pour inside. The sound was deafening, a constant roar of wind punctuated by the crashes of flying debris and tearing metal. For the people inside, many of whom were elderly, disabled, or families with small children, the experience was terrifying. The levees failed. As dawn broke on August 29th, the storm began to pass, and for a brief moment, it seemed that New Orleans might have dodged the worst. The city had experienced significant damage from wind and rain, but many of the buildings downtown and in the French Quarter appeared to have survived relatively intact. Mayor Nagin and other officials expressed cautious relief. But this relief was tragically premature. What few people realized at that moment was that the levee system was failing catastrophically in multiple locations throughout the city. The first major breach occurred along the Industrial Canal, which runs through the heart of New Orleans' Lower Ninth Ward. The storm surge pushed water through the canal with tremendous force, and in the early morning hours, the levee walls began to give way. Water exploded through the breaches, creating a wall of water that swept through the Lower Ninth Ward with devastating force. Homes were torn from their foundations and smashed into each other. Cars floated and tumbled through the streets. People who had survived the hurricane by taking refuge on upper floors or in attics suddenly found themselves trapped as water rose with shocking speed. Some managed to break through their roofs and escape to the tops of their houses. Others were not so fortunate. The Lower Ninth Ward was one of New Orleans' most historic African-American neighborhoods, home to working-class families, many of whom owned their homes, a source of enormous pride and the foundation of whatever wealth they had accumulated. In a matter of hours, generations of history, family photographs, heirlooms, and property were destroyed. But the Industrial Canal breaches were just the beginning. Along the 17th Street Canal, the London Avenue Canal, and other locations, the levees and floodwalls that were supposed to protect New Orleans from Lake Pontchartrain began failing. These were not simple overtopping failures where water spilled over the top of levees during the storm. These were structural failures where the walls themselves collapsed or were breached. The failure mechanisms would later become the subject of intense investigation. In many cases, the floodwalls failed because they were built on weak foundation soils that couldn't support the lateral pressure of the water. The pilings that anchored the walls to the ground were too short, and as water pushed against the walls, the foundation soils liquefied or slid, causing the walls to topple over or push outward, opening gaps through which water rushed. Water poured through these breaches at an estimated rate of approximately 500,000 cubic feet per second, roughly equivalent to the flow over Niagara Falls. This water had nowhere to go but into the bowl of New Orleans, and because the city sits below sea level, once the water got in, it had no natural way to drain out. Throughout August 29th and into August 30th, water levels rose relentlessly across 80% of New Orleans. In some neighborhoods, the water reached 20 feet deep. Entire communities were submerged beneath murky, toxic floodwaters contaminated with sewage, chemicals, oil, and debris, trapped in the flood. As the scope of the flooding became clear, thousands of people found themselves trapped. Those who had evacuated to attics as water rose now faced a horrible choice: stay in the sweltering heat with no food or water, or try to break through their roofs to signal for help. The image of people stranded on rooftops, waving sheets and shirts to attract the attention of rescue helicopters, became one of the defining visuals of Katrina. These scenes were broadcast around the world, showing a major American city in a state of crisis that seemed more characteristic of a developing nation than the world's wealthiest country. Rescue efforts were heroic but chaotic. The U.S. Coast Guard launched what would become the largest search and rescue operation in its history, plucking more than 33,000 people from rooftops, attics, and floodwaters using helicopters and boats. Coast Guard rescue swimmers jumped into toxic floodwater again and again, pulling people to safety under extraordinarily dangerous conditions. The Louisiana Department of Wildlife and Fisheries mobilized its agents and their boats, working around the clock to navigate through flooded neighborhoods. Private citizens with boats, the so-called Cajun Navy, traveled from surrounding areas to help with rescue efforts, navigating through debris-choked waters to reach stranded residents. But the scale of the disaster overwhelmed these initial efforts. With communications networks down, rescuers had no comprehensive map of where people were trapped. They moved from house to house, looking for signs of life, breaking down doors, and searching attics. Many elderly and disabled people who couldn't climb to their roofs or signal for help perished in the floodwaters. The horror stories that emerged were heartbreaking. Families separated in the chaos of evacuation and rescue. Elderly people dying in nursing homes as staff abandoned them. Parents forced to make impossible choices about which child to save first. Bodies floating in the water or discovered weeks later in attics and bedrooms. The Superdome and Convention Center. Humanitarian crisis. The situation at the Superdome deteriorated rapidly. The facility, which had minimal supplies and was never designed to house people for an extended period, became desperately overcrowded. The air conditioning failed, and in the August heat, temperatures inside climbed to over 100 degrees. The plumbing system broke down, and sewage overflowed from bathrooms. People waited in line for hours for food and water, which were in critically short supply. Medical care was virtually non-existent. People with chronic conditions ran out of medication. Babies needed formula and diapers. The elderly and infirm suffered in the heat and squalor. Security broke down as frustration and desperation grew. Fights broke out. There were reports of assaults and robberies, though many of these reports were later found to be exaggerated or false. The reality was bad enough without embellishment. Thousands of American citizens trapped in a darkened, sweltering stadium with inadequate food, water, and sanitation, with no clear information about when they would be evacuated or where they would go. The situation at the convention center was even worse. Thousands of people gathered there, having been directed by police or simply hearing that buses would evacuate people from that location. But no official preparations had been made at the convention center. There were no supplies, no security, no medical care, no information. People slept on the sidewalks outside the convention center, in the heat and sun, with no shade or protection. The elderly sat in wheelchairs, slowly succumbing to dehydration and heat exhaustion. Several people died on the streets outside the convention center, their bodies covered with sheets or blankets, as crowds milled around in a state of shocked disbelief that this could be happening in America. The media images from the Superdome and Convention Center shocked the nation and the world. Reporters described scenes of third world-like conditions, with desperate people begging for help, babies crying, and bodies lying uncollected in the heat. The question on everyone's mind was, where was the government? Where was the help? The response failure. The governmental response to Katrina at all levels, local, state, and federal, was marked by confusion, miscommunication, and delays that cost lives and deepened the suffering of survivors. At the local level, Mayor Nagin and the New Orleans city government were overwhelmed and, in many cases, non-functional. City Hall was flooded. Communication systems were down. Many city employees had evacuated or were dealing with their own family emergencies. The police and fire departments, while containing many heroes who worked tirelessly to save lives, were understaffed and under-equipped for a disaster of this magnitude. There were reports of police officers abandoning their posts, and in one notorious incident, officers shot and killed unarmed civilians on the Danziger Bridge under circumstances that were later determined to be unjustified and potentially criminal. Some officers were later prosecuted and convicted for these shootings and the subsequent cover-up. At the state level, Governor Blanco activated the Louisiana National Guard and requested federal assistance. but the coordination between state and federal authorities was poor. There were bureaucratic turf battles and confusion about who was in charge and what resources were available. The federal response, coordinated by FEMA and the Department of Homeland Security, was catastrophically slow and inadequate. Despite days of warning that Katrina was approaching and would likely cause massive flooding in New Orleans, federal assets were not pre-positioned or mobilized effectively. FEMA Director Michael Brown, a political appointee with little emergency management experience, became the face of federal failure. His apparent lack of urgency and his infamous emails discussing wardrobe choices while New Orleans drowned became symbols of governmental incompetence. President George W. Bush's comment to Brown, "Brownie, you're doing a heck of a job," while Americans watched people dying on their televisions, became one of the most politically damaging moments of his presidency. The military response, while ultimately massive, was slow to deploy. Active-duty military forces require specific authorization to operate domestically, and there was confusion and delay about these authorities. The National Guard was deployed, but many Louisiana Guard units were serving in Iraq, taking with them equipment and vehicles that would have been invaluable in the rescue and recovery effort. By September 1st, 4 days after landfall, federal troops were finally arriving in significant numbers. The 82nd Airborne Division, the 1st Cavalry Division, and other active-duty military units deployed to New Orleans, bringing order, security, and logistical capability. But the question persisted, why did it take so long? Why was the world's most powerful military unable to respond more quickly to a disaster in its own country? Part of the answer lay in the federal system itself and the complex division of responsibilities between local, state, and federal governments. Legally and traditionally, state and local governments have primary responsibility for disaster response, with federal assistance provided when requested and authorized. But Katrina exceeded the capacity of local and state governments immediately, and the federal government was slow to recognize this and act decisively. There were also failures of imagination and preparation. Despite the Hurricane Pam exercise and numerous other warnings, there was no detailed, workable plan for evacuating and caring for tens of thousands of people who couldn't evacuate themselves. There was no plan for dealing with a complete breakdown of civil authority in a major American city. The assumption seemed to be that such things simply didn't happen in the United States, an assumption that Katrina brutally disproved. Evacuation and diaspora. As federal and military forces finally established control, the massive evacuation of survivors began. Buses arrived at the Superdome and Convention Center, loading exhausted, traumatized people for transport to shelters across the country. The evacuation created one of the largest internal refugee crises in American history. Hundreds of thousands of people were dispersed to shelters in Texas, Arkansas, Tennessee, Georgia, and dozens of other states. Houston's Astrodome became a shelter for thousands of evacuees, and hotels across the South were filled with displaced New Orleans residents. Families were separated in the chaos. Children were evacuated on buses without their parents. Elderly people were sent to different states than their adult children. The lack of coordination meant that people often had no idea where their loved ones had been taken, and with phone systems down and no central database, reunification was slow and difficult. For many evacuees, the experience of being dispersed across the country was traumatic. They had lost everything: homes, possessions, jobs, communities, and in many cases, family members whose fates were unknown. Now they found themselves in unfamiliar cities, dependent on charity and government assistance, with no clear path home. Some host communities welcomed evacuees with genuine compassion and support. Churches, schools, and community organizations mobilized to provide housing, food, clothing, and assistance. But evacuees also faced suspicion and prejudice in some areas. There were reports of discrimination in housing and employment, and some communities resisted efforts to place evacuees in their areas. The disaster exposed and exacerbated racial and class divisions. The images from New Orleans showed overwhelmingly poor African American residents trapped by the floods and abandoned by their government. White suburbs and wealthier neighborhoods, built on higher ground, were generally less affected. The disparity was stark and undeniable, leading to intense national debate about poverty, racism, and inequality in America. Rapper Kanye West captured the anger many felt during a live television fundraiser when he departed from the script to declare, "George Bush doesn't care about black people." While Bush and his supporters rejected this characterization, the comment reflected a widespread perception that the slow response was rooted in the racial and economic status of Katrina's primary victims. The death toll and human cost. The exact death toll from Hurricane Katrina may never be known with certainty, but official estimates place it at approximately 1,800 people across the Gulf Coast. In Louisiana alone, more than 1,500 people died, with the majority of deaths occurring in the New Orleans metropolitan area. The victims ranged from infants to the elderly. Some drowned in the initial flooding. Others died from dehydration, heat exposure, lack of medical care, or injuries during the disaster. Many elderly residents in nursing homes died when they were abandoned by staff or couldn't be evacuated in time. The process of recovering and identifying bodies took months. Search teams moved through flooded neighborhoods, marking houses with spray paint to indicate whether they had been searched and how many bodies were found inside. The images of these marked houses, 0 dead, 1 dead, 2 dead, painted on front doors became another haunting symbol of the disaster. Many bodies were so decomposed or damaged that identification was difficult. DNA testing and dental records were used to identify victims. Families waited weeks or months for confirmation that loved ones had died, and some bodies were never positively identified. Beyond the death toll, the disaster caused immense psychological trauma. Survivors suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, and anxiety. The experience of watching your city drown, losing everything you own, being separated from family, and struggling to rebuild created deep psychological scars that persisted for years. Suicide rates among survivors increased significantly in the years following Katrina. Substance abuse, domestic violence, and mental health crises all rose. Children who lived through the disaster showed elevated rates of behavioral problems and academic difficulties years later. The economic devastation. The economic cost of Hurricane Katrina was staggering. Total property damage was estimated at approximately $125 billion in 2005 dollars, making it the costliest natural disaster in American history up to that point. In New Orleans alone, approximately 134,000 housing units were damaged or destroyed. Entire neighborhoods were rendered uninhabitable. Businesses large and small were wiped out. The Port of New Orleans, a major economic engine for the region and the nation, was heavily damaged. Oil and gas production in the Gulf of Mexico was disrupted, contributing to nationwide increases in fuel prices. The long-term economic impact extended far beyond the immediate damage. New Orleans lost more than half its population in the immediate aftermath of the storm, dropping from approximately 450,000 residents before Katrina to fewer than 200,000 in the months afterward. This population loss devastated the city's tax base and economic vitality. Businesses couldn't reopen because they had no customers and no employees, and employees couldn't return because there were no jobs and no homes. This vicious cycle made economic recovery agonizingly slow. The insurance industry faced unprecedented claims, and many property owners discovered that their insurance policies didn't cover flood damage, only wind damage. This distinction became the source of thousands of lawsuits and bitter disputes. Many homeowners had wind damage and flood damage, and insurance companies and policyholders fought over which type of damage occurred first and which was the primary cause of destruction. Federal flood insurance, provided through the National Flood Insurance Program, paid out more than $16 billion in claims. But this still left many homeowners underinsured or uninsured. People who had dutifully paid mortgages for decades found themselves owing money on homes that no longer existed, with insufficient insurance proceeds to rebuild. The long road to recovery. The recovery and rebuilding of the FEMA provided temporary housing in the form of trailers for displaced residents. But these programs were inefficient and sometimes counterproductive. Thousands of trailers sat in used and staging areas due to bureaucratic delays, while people lived in damaged homes or remained displaced. When trailers were finally deployed, many were later found to contain dangerous levels of formaldehyde, creating a new health crisis at Gulf Coast, particularly New Orleans, became one of the most complex and controversial reconstruction efforts in American history. Congress appropriated more than $120 billion in federal funding for Katrina recovery and rebuilding. This money funded everything from debris removal to levee reconstruction to housing assistance. But the distribution and use of these funds was plagued by bureaucracy, waste, and fraud. The Road Home Program, Louisiana's main program for providing compensation to homeowners for their losses, was a bureaucratic nightmare. Homeowners waited years for compensation, filling out extensive paperwork and dealing with constant requests for additional documentation. The program's formula for calculating compensation was criticized as inequitable, particularly because it was based on pre-storm property values, meaning that homeowners in predominantly African-American neighborhoods with lower property values received less compensation than those in wealthier areas, even if their damage was equivalent. The rebuilding of New Orleans' levee system became a massive engineering project managed by the Army Corps of Engineers. The Corps embarked on a $14.5 billion effort to rebuild and strengthen the levees, flood walls, and pumping stations. New floodgates and barriers were constructed to block storm surge from entering the canals that had failed during Katrina. This work was completed by 2011, and the new system was designed to provide protection against a 100-year storm. A storm with a 1% chance of occurring in any given year, roughly equivalent to a fast-moving Category 3 hurricane. While this was a significant improvement over the pre-Katrina system, it still fell short of protection against another Category 5 storm like Katrina at peak intensity. The rebuilding of neighborhoods was uneven and reflected deep disparities. Wealthier neighborhoods with stronger social capital and more resources recovered faster. The French Quarter and Garden District, which experienced less flooding and housed more affluent residents and businesses, came back relatively quickly. But working-class neighborhoods, particularly predominantly African-American areas like the Lower Ninth Ward, New Orleans East, and Gentilly, recovered much more slowly, if at all. Years after the storm, these neighborhoods remained dotted with empty lots, abandoned houses, and Katrina refrigerators, rusted refrigerators from flooded homes, left on curbs as grim reminders of the disaster. The Lower Ninth Ward became a symbol of both devastation and resistance. Some residents vowed to return and rebuild no matter what, seeing their return as an act of cultural preservation and defiance against forces that seemed designed to push them out permanently. Organizations like Common Ground Relief and the Make It Right Foundation, founded by actor Brad Pitt, worked to help residents return and rebuild. But others never came back. Some couldn't afford to rebuild. Others had established new lives in the cities where they evacuated and chose to stay there. Still others simply couldn't face the trauma of returning to a place with such painful memories. Educational and cultural impact. Hurricane Katrina devastated New Orleans' public education system. Before the storm, the Orleans Parish School Board operated one of the most troubled school systems in the country, with low academic performance, poor facilities, and endemic financial and management problems. Katrina essentially destroyed this system. School buildings were flooded and damaged. Teachers and students were scattered across the country. In the aftermath, Louisiana state authorities took control of most New Orleans public schools, and the city became the nation's first all-charter school district. This transformation was controversial. Supporters argued that the charter system brought innovation, accountability, and improved academic performance. Critics contended that the post-Katrina education reforms displaced experienced teachers, many of whom were African American, weakened unions, and created an inequitable system where some charter schools thrived while others struggled. The cultural impact of Katrina on New Orleans was profound. The city's unique culture, its music, food, architecture, traditions, and social fabric, faced an existential threat. Musicians, artists, chefs, and cultural practitioners were scattered across the country. Historic music clubs and cultural institutions were damaged or destroyed. There were real fears that the New Orleans that had given the world jazz, the Mardi Gras Indians, second-line parades, and a distinctive Creole culture would be permanently altered or lost. The displacement of working-class African-American communities who were the bearers of much of this cultural tradition was particularly threatening to cultural continuity. However, Culture also became a tool of resilience and recovery. Musicians organized benefit concerts. The first Mardi Gras after Katrina, in February 2006, became an act of defiance and celebration, with residents and visitors flooding back to the city to prove that the spirit of New Orleans could not be drowned. The Jazz Fest returned. Restaurants reopened. Brass bands marched in the streets. While the city had changed and some traditions were disrupted, the core cultural identity of New Orleans proved remarkably resilient. Lessons and reforms. Hurricane Katrina prompted significant reforms in emergency management, disaster response, and infrastructure planning, though questions remain about whether these reforms are sufficient. FEMA underwent substantial reorganization and received increased funding. The Post-Katrina Emergency Management Reform Act of 2006 strengthened FEMA's authority and resources, improved coordination mechanisms, and required more comprehensive disaster planning. The National Response Framework was updated to clarify roles and responsibilities among federal, state, and local governments. The concept of dual status command was developed to allow better coordination between National Guard forces under state control and active duty military forces under federal control. Emergency communications systems were improved, with more robust, redundant systems designed to survive disasters. Greater emphasis was placed on pre-positioning resources and supplies before disasters strike, rather than waiting for requests for assistance. The levee and coastal protection systems of Louisiana received unprecedented investment, though many experts argue that more needs to be done, particularly regarding coastal restoration. Louisiana's coast continues to lose land to erosion and subsidence, leaving communities increasingly vulnerable. Climate change has made the lessons of Katrina even more urgent. Rising sea levels, warming ocean temperatures that can fuel more intense hurricanes, and changing precipitation patterns all suggest that communities must prepare for more frequent and severe disasters. Cities across the country reviewed their own vulnerabilities in light of Katrina's lessons. Coastal cities in particular examined their evacuation plans, levee systems, and emergency response capabilities. But comprehensive resilience planning remains expensive and politically difficult, particularly when it requires hard choices about where development should occur and whether some areas should be abandoned rather than rebuilt. The lasting legacy. Nearly 2 decades after Hurricane Katrina, the storm's legacy continues to shape the Gulf Coast, American disaster policy, and national consciousness. New Orleans has rebuilt and in many ways thrived, with a population that rebounded to approximately 390,000 by 2020, still below pre-Katrina levels, but substantially recovered from the immediate post-storm nadir. The city's economy has diversified beyond its traditional dependence on oil, gas, and port activity, with growth in technology, healthcare, and tourism. The city's cultural renaissance has been remarkable, with a vibrant music scene, acclaimed restaurants, and renewed architectural preservation efforts. However, this recovery has not been equitable. Gentrification has displaced long-time residents in some neighborhoods. Affordable housing remains scarce. Income and racial inequality persist. The Katrina diaspora permanently altered demographics across the South. Houston, Atlanta, Dallas, and other cities absorbed large populations of former New Orleanians who never returned. These new residents brought cultural influences that changed their adopted cities, creating New Orleans-style restaurants, social aid and pleasure clubs, and cultural connections that persist. For many survivors, Katrina remains the defining event of their lives. The anniversary of the storm each August brings remembrance ceremonies, media coverage, and for many, renewed trauma. Mental health impacts persist, particularly for those who lost loved ones, homes, or communities. The political impact of Katrina was significant. The perception of governmental failure damaged President Bush's approval ratings and likely influenced the 2006 midterm elections, in which Democrats won control of Congress. The disaster raised questions about governmental competence and priorities that continued to resonate in subsequent elections. Katrina also influenced subsequent disaster responses. When Hurricane Gustav threatened New Orleans in 2008, authorities implemented a much more aggressive evacuation, with the Coast Guard pre-positioning assets and the city providing transportation for those without vehicles. The contrast with Katrina was stark and deliberate. During Hurricane Isaac in 2012 and subsequent storms, the improved levee system and emergency response protocols were tested, generally performing better than during Katrina, though challenges remained. When Hurricane Harvey struck Houston in 2017, many compared the flooding disaster to Katrina, and some of the same questions arose about preparation, response, and why certain communities were more vulnerable than others. Environmental and social justice dimensions. Katrina highlighted environmental justice issues that had long existed but gained new visibility. The neighborhoods that flooded most severely were disproportionately poor and African American. These communities had been historically relegated to less desirable land, lower-lying areas more prone to flooding. The environmental contamination from the floodwaters was severe. Industrial sites released toxic chemicals. Underground storage tanks leaked petroleum products. Sewage mixed with floodwater. When the water receded, it left behind a toxic residue that coated homes, soil, and possessions. The health impacts of this contamination are still being studied, but elevated rates of respiratory problems, cancer, and other illnesses have been documented in some affected communities. Workers involved in demolition and rebuilding often lacked adequate protective equipment and suffered exposure to mold, asbestos, and other hazards. The storm also highlighted issues of environmental sustainability. The wetlands that once protected New Orleans had been systematically destroyed by development, oil and gas extraction, and water management practices. Restoring these wetlands became a priority in post-Katrina planning, with massive coastal restoration projects undertaken to rebuild barrier islands, marshes, and natural storm buffers. However, coastal restoration faces enormous challenges, including limited funding, complex engineering difficulties, and the accelerating impacts of climate change and sea level rise. Louisiana's Coastal Master Plan envisions spending $50 billion over 50 years on restoration and protection, but whether this will be sufficient to save coastal communities remains uncertain. Media coverage and narrative shaping. The media coverage of Katrina was intensive and played a crucial role in shaping public understanding of the disaster, though it was not without problems. In the immediate aftermath, reporters on the ground provided dramatic, often heartbreaking coverage that brought the disaster into American living rooms with unprecedented immediacy. Reporters waded through floodwaters, helped rescue survivors, and openly criticized the slow governmental response. This advocacy journalism departed from traditional norms of objectivity, but reflected the extraordinary circumstances. However, some media coverage also spread misinformation, particularly regarding crime and social disorder. Reports of rampant violence, including murders, rapes, and shootings at the Superdome and Convention Center, were widely circulated but later proved to be largely exaggerated or false. New Orleans Police Superintendent Eddie Compass told Oprah Winfrey that babies are getting raped at the Superdome, a claim that was never substantiated. Such reports, while perhaps reflecting the genuine chaos and fear of the moment, contributed to racial stereotyping and may have slowed rescue efforts, as some authorities hesitated to send personnel into areas they believed were lawless. The actual crime rate during and immediately after Katrina was complex. While there were certainly incidents of looting, violence, and social disorder, many reported crimes never occurred. The distinction between looting, taking goods illegally, and obtaining necessary supplies for survival, became a subject of racial controversy when media outlets seemed to describe similar actions differently based on the race of the people involved. Subsequent media investigations revealed that some of the worst reported violence was perpetrated not by desperate survivors, but by police and vigilantes. The Danziger Bridge shootings, in which police killed unarmed civilians, and reports of white vigilantes in Algiers Point shooting at African-American evacuees trying to cross the bridge out of New Orleans, revealed a darker dimension of the disaster's social breakdown, comparative disasters, and future vulnerabilities. Katrina remains the costliest natural disaster in U.S. history when measured by property damage, though Hurricane Harvey in 2017, $125 billion, nearly equaled it. And when adjusted for inflation and economic growth, some historical hurricanes like the 1900 Galveston hurricane would rival Katrina's economic impact. In terms of death toll, Katrina was the deadliest U.S. hurricane since the 1928 Okeechobee hurricane. which killed at least 2,500 people and far deadlier than any hurricane since. However, it's important to note that by global standards, Katrina's death toll, while tragic, was relatively small compared to some international disasters. The 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami killed an estimated 230,000 people. Cyclone Nargis, which struck Myanmar in 2008, killed at least 138,000 people. The 2010 Haiti earthquake killed an estimated 220,000 people. These comparisons offer no comfort to Katrina's victims, but provide context about relative disaster preparedness and resilience. The question of future vulnerability remains pressing. Climate science indicates that while the frequency of hurricanes may not increase dramatically, the intensity of the strongest hurricanes is likely to increase as ocean temperatures rise. This means more Category 4 and 5 storms, with more devastating wind and higher storm surge. Sea level rise exacerbates storm surge risk, meaning that a storm of the same strength will cause higher water levels in the future than it would today. For low-lying coastal cities like New Orleans, this creates an accelerating threat that may eventually make some areas indefensible. Beyond New Orleans, many other American communities face similar vulnerabilities. Miami and South Florida sit barely above sea level and face both hurricane and sea level rise threats. New York City's vulnerability was demonstrated by Hurricane Sandy in 2012. Houston's flood risk was highlighted by Hurricane Harvey. The question society must grapple with is how to balance development, resilience, and retreat. Should governments continue to subsidize rebuilding in areas that will likely flood again? Should flood insurance rates reflect true risk, even if this makes coastal living unaffordable for many? Should some communities be relocated rather than rebuilt? These are difficult questions with no easy answers, touching on property rights, cultural preservation, economic development, and environmental sustainability. Conclusion: a changed America. Hurricane Katrina was more than a natural disaster. It was a revelation of American vulnerabilities and inequalities that many had preferred to ignore. The images of desperate Americans abandoned on rooftops in a major city shocked the national conscience and challenged assumptions about American exceptionalism and governmental competence. The disaster revealed that infrastructure taken for granted, levees, emergency communications, evacuation systems, was inadequate. It showed that assumptions about who could evacuate and who would be left behind were based on class and race in ways that were both predictable and shameful. It demonstrated that the social safety net had gaping holes through which vulnerable people could fall. But Katrina also revealed extraordinary resilience, compassion, and determination. The Coast Guard rescue swimmers who saved thousands of lives. The Cajun Navy volunteers who risked their own safety to help strangers. The communities across America that welcomed evacuees. The survivors who lost everything but somehow found the strength to rebuild. The recovery of New Orleans, while incomplete and unequal, stands as a testament to human resilience and the power of cultural identity. The city that many predicted would never recover has not only survived but in many ways thrived, preserving its unique cultural heritage while adapting to new realities. The lessons of Katrina remain relevant today. As climate change brings more intense storms, rising seas, and increased flooding, the question is whether we have truly learned from Katrina's catastrophe or whether we will be condemned to repeat its failures in future disasters. The story of Hurricane Katrina is ultimately a story about vulnerability and resilience, about failure and determination, about a city and a nation tested by nature and found wanting, but which somehow found the strength to begin again. It reminds us that the way society prepares for and responds to disasters reveals fundamental truths about priorities, values, and the bonds that hold communities together or tear them apart. Nearly 2 decades later, Hurricane Katrina continues to echo through American life, a reminder of what can go wrong when natural hazards meet human vulnerabilities, and a call to action to build more resilient, equitable communities that can withstand the storms yet to come.